Through the book of First Samuel. Tonight we find ourselves in the 30th chapter. So if you would open your Bibles to First Samuel chapter 30, and then we're going to be looking at just this time of David with, as we're going to see initially, with just his loss, strengthening himself in the Lord, and then just that area of God just speaking to him, the restoration that God gives him, and then David just does this amazing thing about just sharing, and so it just really talks about the rewards that we can have. So with that, let's pray. Let's go before the Lord. Father, we're so grateful for your grace, your goodness in our lives, your blessings. Father, even in our low points, like when we're with David, God, we're so grateful that when we turn to you, you're going to hear us. When we cry out to you, you'll listen. And it won't be like Saul, where you wouldn't speak to him and you wouldn't allow him to hear from you at all, where you just simply rejected him, Lord. But Father, you will speak and you will move and you will minister. And so we're so grateful for that truth that you're going to reveal to us here tonight. We are asking, Lord, that through your spirit, just give your word life, knit us to your heart, truly with your spirit and the power of your word. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. As we find ourselves here in chapter 30, remember in chapter 29, we'd already looked at that point where David had joined himself to the Philistines. And as he joined himself to the Philistines, we've seen that Achish gave him Ziklag as a town, and so that was his camp. That's where him and his wives and his men and their families all stayed. And so then David had left Ziklag. He's gone all the way up where they're at Aphek. So he traveled about 50 some miles to Aphek. And then as he was there at Aphek, they were doing the parade as all the soldiers would go before the leaders. And then the Philistine princes rejected David. They said, what are these Hebrews doing here? And so they made Achish send David home. And so David is now, after traveling, 55 miles up to Aphek, now he travels 55 miles back down to Ziklag. And so within this 4 day period, 4 or 5 day period, he's already traveled 100 miles with his 600 men. And so you begin to see a little bit what's happening here, why David and his men would be weary, why they would be exhausted, why they're going through the trials they are. And so um, in chapter 30, verse 1, it simply begins this. Now it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but they carried them away and went their way. Verse 3, when David and his men came to the city, there it was burned with fire. Their wives, their sons, their daughters had been taken captive. And David and the people who were with them lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. So I do want you to understand that here David is going against the Amalekites, or the Amalekites have come against Ziklag when David and his men were joining the Philistines and were going to go to war. Now keep in mind that David and his men would still, if they hadn't sent them home, would still be at war, would not recognize that, wow, this has just happened. And so in these days that we've left and gone, to basically to Aphek and gone before the princes and they send us home. Within these days, the Amalekites have already come and have raided. They've already taken Ziklag and have burned it and then taken all the wives and the children. A couple of things I want you to be aware of in 1 Samuel chapter 27. David does something interesting. And I want to show you just a little bit of a contrast to see just truly how God's grace has come upon David. Because, we understand that according to Galatians, we sow what we reap. But it makes this declaration in 1 Samuel chapter 27, in verses 8 and 9, it declares this. And David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, the Amalekites, for those nations were the inhabitants of the land from of old, and as you go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. So when David had done his raids, part of the peoples that he had raided among the Geshurites and the Girzites were the Amalekites. And in verse 11, it made this statement. And I find this incredible to see God's grace. It says in verse 11 of 1 Samuel 27, David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring the news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform on us, saying, thus David did, and thus was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. So when David would raid the Amalekites, he wouldn't just take of their stuff. He would literally wipe out every man and every woman as he would go down south in the desert to attack them. Well, at this point, now the Amalekites have come and they have now done their own raid to the north. And so raids to the south, raids to the north. And as we saw there in chapter 17, verse 8, that David also attacked the Amalekites. Amazingly, I want you to see here where it says in verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 30. Now it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag, and burned it with fire. Okay, now they completely destroy the city. They completely, it's burned, it's razed. And then verse 2, they took captive of the women and those who were from there, from small to great. And I love it how in the middle of that verse 2, it says they did not kill anyone, but they carried them away. You see the grace of God that here all of David's men, all of David's men's wives, and David's wives are all alive. So they've just been taken captive. And so I want you to understand what's been happening now. David and his men have traveled, you know, 50 some miles to go to the north. And as they found themselves at Aphek, they were rejected. They now travel 50 some miles back. So when it says this in verse 1, now it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day. That what David and his men have done is they've traveled somewhere about 25 miles a day on foot. So they're marching. And as they're marching, they've now to go 25 miles on one day, 25 miles on another day, and then to come to your house expecting, the greetings, expecting, wow, we're finally home, we can relax. And then to come to your home and to find out, oh my goodness, my home has been burned with fire. My family's gone. It's no wonder they didn't come out to greet me. What's going on here? Even seeing the smoke as they're at a distance. But at this point, I want you to understand that there is this incredible loss that David and his men are experiencing. And so, verse 3, so it was when David and his men came to the city, it was burned with fire. Their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captive. And then in verse 4, David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. You see that they've already been exhausted physically. Now they're exhausted emotionally. And as they're at this point of being just exhausted, trying to figure out what's going on. So amazingly, I just want you to recognize that the beauty of as all this loss that has gone on with David, that he's now lost his the city is gone, his town is gone, and David has nobody. He can't go to Israel and say, hey, could you help me out? He knows Israel's already gone to war. He can't go into Israel because Saul is pursuing his life, and so he can't go to the Philistines to zero out war. David literally has no one. He has nobody. He has no one in Judah. He has no one in Israel. He has no one with the Philistines. And so basically, and now he can't even go to his family for comfort. His wives are gone. His men's families are gone. And so, all of his possessions are gone. There's nothing that David has, nothing that David can grab onto to find any comfort. And on top of that, the amazing thing there in verse 5 and 6, it says, now, and David's two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and daughters. And we recognize here that David has nothing. Not even his men are wanting to follow him. Not even his men are coming alongside of him. And so David is at this complete loss of everything. He has nothing. But I want you to understand that the loss is not the end of the story. The loss is the beginning of the story. I mean, think of Job. Job, the whole issue with passage that, declaring his life, the loss wasn't the end of his life. The loss was the beginning of the event. And so I think it's so important to recognize that there are going to be times that we as Christians face loss. There's going to be times where we as Christians will experience loss, but the loss is not the end of the story. The loss is the beginning. And I think it's just important as a Christian to stand on that when you have this area where David, you know, things are horrible for him. They're devastating for him. And on top of that, the men that he's supposed to be looking over and watching over, they're all thinking about stoning him now. So I want you to see here that David has absolutely nothing left. He has nothing, this complete loss of what happened. But amazingly, then we see that in verse 6, where David was greatly distressed, for all the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and daughters. But David, and I love this, he strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So incredible that here, although David can't seek any earthly help, we can recognize that he can seek the spiritual help, he can seek the heavenly help, and that's what he seeks to do. So he comes to God and he strengthens himself truly in the Lord. And as he strengthens himself in the Lord, a couple of passages I just want to share with you, just as a note taker, jot them down. The first is found in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 3. And it says this, when it talked about the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, this is what Jesus said when he began his ministry. This is the passage that he quoted from Isaiah. But in verse 3, it says, to console those who mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes, and the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they may be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. And I love how Isaiah 61:3 puts this out, that it's the beginning of the story. It's not the end. It's the beginning of the event. It's not the end. And in Hosea chapter 6, verse 1, he makes this statement where he says, come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. And then after 2 days, he will revive us. And on the third day, he will raise us up. Absolutely amazing where sometimes God will allow events to crush us. He'll allow events to take away any strength that we have. He'll allow events so that there's only one place. So you figure I can't turn to anywhere except God. And then you turn to God and you realize this is where I needed to be all along. And so just as this beautiful thing that here David, as he strengthens himself in the Lord, in verse 7 and 8, it says, and David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, please bring the ephod here to me. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. And so David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he, that is God, answered him, that is David. I love verse 8. David has been, basically walking away from the Lord for 16 months. He's been, there with the Philistines. He's gone to, he's aligned himself with Achish, the king of the Philistines. And as he does so, he now comes to the point where he has nothing. He calls on God, and God in his grace still answers. God in his grace still moves. And so what a beautiful thing that it says in the end of verse 8, where after it says, so David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him. God answers David, says, pursue, for you will surely overtake them and without fail recover all. I want to share with you just a brief difference of what happens when David sought the Lord and what happened when Saul sought the Lord. If you remember in chapter 28, in verses 3 through 6, it said, Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented for him and had buried him in Ramah in his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. And the Philistines gathered together, and they came and encamped in Shunem. So Saul gathered all of Israel together, and they encamped at Gilboa. And when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And verse 6 of 1 Samuel 28 said, and when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. God wouldn't speak to Saul at all. And so it would come to that point where he would actually call Samuel up through a medium, through the witch of Endor, and Samuel would then say, "Hey, listen, why did you call me up? What are you doing this for?" We looked at that a few weeks ago, and eventually Samuel was going to tell Saul, "Listen, you're going to be with me before this tomorrow. I'm going to meet you. You're going to be right with me here in this abode of the dead." But I love the fact that here, although God does not answer Saul, God in his grace chooses to answer David. And an amazing thing is that David actually inquires of the Lord in verse 8. Now, he inquires of the Lord, and when he inquires of the Lord, he simply says, "Shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them?" Keep in mind that David is the one of which they sang, David has slain his 10,000s. Saul is thousands, David is 10,000s. And David is a man of war. And at the same time, so amazingly, that here he asks God if he should pursue those who burned his village. Now think about this. This is a man of war who a people have just burned his village, taken his wives, taken the wives and the family of his men. And he goes to God and said, should I seek vengeance? Should I go get them back? Absolutely amazing that David doesn't just assume this is what I do. This is what I'm made for, and then I'm a man of war. They're asking for war. I'm going to go get my wives back. I'm going to get the families back. I'm going to go get my stuff back. He doesn't do that. He inquires of God, and it's absolutely incredible to me that here David in his greatest strengths now says, "Lord, I'm not even going to apply my strengths. I'm going to ask you, do you want to use those, or do you want to use something else?" And so he goes before the Lord, and I love God. He says, "Pursue them. You're going to overtake them, and without fail, you're going to recover all." And so David at this point recognizes what's going to happen. And so we begin to see that here in this next portion that David is going to get, and he's going to restore everything. But I want you to understand that within this restoration, it doesn't come without trials, it doesn't come without issues that David has to overcome. It begins this in verse 9. So David went, and he and the 600 men who were with him, and he came to the brook Bezor, where those stayed who were left behind. But David pursued, and he and 400 men, 200 stayed behind, who were so weary that they could not cross the brook Bezor. So I want you to understand that David and his men, they have now traveled. Keep in mind, they traveled for 2 days, 25 miles ish a day. Marching with the equipment for war. They marched up to Aphek, and as they go up to Aphek, eventually now they have to turn around. They march 2 days back, and when they get back, there's no rest. Now there's this emotional upheaval where they're absolutely drained, where they have no more strength, they have no more power to weep. They're just emotionally distraught, and so David goes before the Lord, and now they get back and they travel again another 20 miles. And so as they're coming now to the Brook Bezor, for those of you that understand this area, the Brook Bezor actually goes right by Beersheba. If you're familiar with Beersheba, it's about 20 some miles south of Ziklag. And in Judges chapter 20, verse 1, it makes this statement from Dan to Beersheba. In other words, Dan is the most northern part of Israel, Beersheba is the most southern part of Israel. According to Joshua 19 in the first two verses, we understand that this was Simeon's territory, and Simeon's territory was inside or within the inheritance of Judah. So it was the most southern part of Israel. And so they now go to the most southern part of Israel. They go to the Brook Bezor, and as they're there, now what happens is this. It says in verse 9, as David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and he came to the brook Bezor, where those who stayed were left behind. So at this point, he comes up to this brook, and we understand, according to verse 10, why they were left behind. It says David pursued, he and 400 men, and for 200 stayed behind, who were so weary they could not cross the brook Bezor. So here's men who have basically marched, like 120 20 miles in the last 5 days, and they are absolutely exhausted. And as they've made this march, they're now weary, grieving emotionally. They're emptied, and one third, understand this, one third of David's fighting force now says, "I'm too exhausted to go on." Now, keep in mind, the other ones are exhausted as well, but they go on. And so David here is fighting with these men with absolute exhaustion, so much that one third of his troops can't go on. And so that's an incredible trial that David faces. So if one third of your troop ends it, do you stop? And David said, no, we still pursue. And we're still going to go. And then what happens is this. It says in verse 11, they found an Egyptian in the field, and they brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate, and they let him drink water, and they gave him a piece of cake, and figs, and 2 clusters of raisins. So when he had eaten, his strength came back to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? And he said, I'm a young man from Egypt, a servant of Amalekite, and my master left me behind because 3 days ago I fell sick. Now, the first trial is this: David loses one third of his fighting force and he still pursues. The second trial is this: there's a man who has been sick, there's a man who has been weakened, a man who is there just kind of cast off into the field. And David and this men minister to this man. They they choose to say, wait a second, aren't I supposed to be, pursuing my family? Aren't I pursuing my wives? Aren't we supposed to be pursuing? And he stops. The entire 400 men stop to help this one man who's in need. And so they minister to him. They give him the bread, they give him water, they give him a piece of cake and some figs and clusters of raisins, and they minister to the guy. And so amazingly, that are you on this path to recover what was taken from you, or are you on this path simply to minister to this Egyptian? I love what God does. God allows this ministry of David's heart to be beneficial to them because he has information. But again, keep in mind that when those 200 men were exhausted, there was again a benefit to David, that he and the other 400 men were able to unload everything that would be burdensome. They didn't have to carry extra weight. They unloaded everything. And these 200 guys that weren't able to cross, he said, now listen, you guys guard all the rest of our stuff. You're going to lighten our load so that we can go. You're going to assist us so that we're not burdened in going. So you're going to benefit us as we continue, but we're not going to have to carry all the weight that we have been. You keep all the excess stuff. We're going to take the necessary stuff and only the necessary stuff. So again, leaving the 200 men back have benefited them, so they don't have to lug this stuff off to war or put it off to the side when they attack, having to worry about that. They have men right now to protect it and to watch over it. These guys are exhausted, yes, but they're the keepers of the stuff. And now you see those benefits that come through both of the decisions that God allows David, he brings before David. The first is, these men are exhausted. Are you going to let them stay? Yes, stay. Keep the excess stuff. Here's a man who's in need. Are you going to minister? Yes, we'll give him bread. We'll give him water. We'll give him figs. We'll give him raisins. And so the man comes, and when David just strikes up this conversation, who are you? Where were you from? And he, of course, in verse 13 says, I'm a young man of Egypt. I'm the slave of an Amalekite. And he says, they left me behind 3 days ago when I fell sick. He says this in verse 14, giving David information. We made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites in the territory which belongs to Judah, and the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, can you take me down to this troop? And so he said, swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this troop. Something I want you to be aware of. In verse 14, where he says, we made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites in the territory which belongs to Judah. and the southern area of Caleb. If you remember back in chapter 28, verse 10, this is where when David was, raiding those areas of the Amalekites, when he was raiding those areas um, down south, what he told um, Achish so amazingly in verse 8, and David said to Achish, wait, let's get back to chapter 28, God, chapter 29. And so what David did was this in chapter 27. Well, let's go there. When David would attack, so he would leave no one alive. But in verse 10 of chapter 27, where Achish would say, "Where have you made a raid today?" David would say, "Against the southern area of Judah, against the southern area of the Jeremites, against the southern area of the Kenites." And so what David would say is, "I've been raiding the southern area of Judah." Now we find out that these Amalekites actually did that. They did raid the southern areas of Judah. And as they raided the southern areas of Judah, they also raided Ziklag, which was on the border. And then, of course, they burned Ziklag with fire. Now, I do want to jump ahead here in chapter 30 to verse 26. And in verse 26, it makes this statement. Now, when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, "Here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." And to those who were in Bethel, to those who were in Ramoth in the south, those who were in Jatir. And we see in verse 28 those who were in Aor, those who were in Shifmoth, those who were in Eshtemoa, and those who were in Rakal, those who were in the cities of the Jeremites, those who were the cities of the Kenites, those who were of Hormah, those who were in Korshan, those who were in Atrak, those who were in Hebron, all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to rove. This is incredible that the Amalekites had raided the southern area of Judah. And what David does is he actually is going to bring part of the bounty of what he's going to recover from the Amalekites, and he's going to be giving it back to the inhabitants of Judah, back to the people who had assisted him when he was fleeing. And so keep in mind that when David comes and he takes on this Amalekite army, this Amalekite bunch of troops that are there, that when they were invading, verse 14, they made the invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites in the territory which belongs to Judah, the southern area of Caleb. And so all of those areas, all those places that they raided, they had brought goods from there too. Now, whether there's people, whether there's more stuff, we know that was part of it. But they had raided those areas, and then also they went to Ziklag, and of course they burned that. They took all the women and the children. And so when David comes to this, he's going to make more recovery of the bounty than just what was taken there in Ziklag, because they had been in those area of the Cherethites in the southern area of Caleb and those areas of southern Judah. So when David says in verse 15, "Can you take me down to this troop?" He said, and so the slave said, "Swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I'll take you down to this troop." And I says, "Okay, don't give me back to this guy. I'll be in trouble, So, and you don't kill me. If you mean me no harm, if you're going to protect me, I'll take you there." And of course, David is going to protect him. And so, verse 16, when he had brought him down, there they were spread out over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil which they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. Now, what he does is he comes upon them in the evening. And as he comes in the evening, what happens is this: he sees them eating, they're having a great feast, they're drinking, they're having this party. It's a celebration, there's dancing. So there's dancing, there's drinking, there's eating. And so while that's going on, they're celebrating. And then in verse 17, David attacked them from twilight until evening the next day. Now, the what he does is this: he waits for them. Twilight can also be interpreted in that it's there in the morning as the sun comes up, and so he attacks them, and so he waits for them to one get drunk. He waits for them to have this party. He waits for them to go to sleep, and he kind of wakes them up with this hangover in a sense. And so David attacked them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who rode on camels fled. And so I just want you to see here what David has done. That David and his men have come to this place where they're now attacking, and so amazingly, verse 18, where David recovered everything. So verse 17, David attacks, and that nothing escapes him except those 400 men who rode on camels. And I want to share with you just another comparison. As you go to chapter 31, in the first verse, says, "Now when the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa." It's amazing that David has a victory, Saul has a defeat. And so you see where God's hand is upon David. And here are these men. We don't know how many there are, but we know that there's enough where there's at least another 400 men that are on camels. They were able to escape, but no one else was able to escape. David and his men had attacked them. And so whether David allowed his men to rest up while he said, okay, get a couple hours sleep, in the morning we're going to get them, just hang on. But there was waiting for them to kind of have the effects of the after effects of the party. And so this is what he does. And so verse 18, David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his two wives, and nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. And so beautifully, we begin to see here that God restores to David. That the loss was the beginning of this passage, it's not the end. And so there's this restoration, but with the restoration is what? It's more than what he started with. The restoration is greater than what he has that he began with. And so absolutely amazing as we begin to see here that David comes and he takes as they do this, David recovered all, and he makes the statement in verse 20. David took all the flocks and the herds that they had driven before those other livestock, and he said, "This is David's spoil." So all the goods that was theirs, they recovered it. And now David makes this statement. Some commentaries say that it's up to me to give out to whom I want. David, when he says this is David's spoil, in other words, I'm going to give to who I desire. I'm going to be the one to parcel out what's here. You guys don't get to do that. I'm going to do that to these men. Or it's simply saying this. David's saying, I'm going to be the one to take everything other than what's ours. And understand what David does is he doesn't do it for himself. Remember back in when we were reading verses 26 through 31, that David goes to all the areas of Judah. So in verse 26, David came to Ziklag, and he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, "Here is a present for you of the spoils of the enemy of the Lord." And of course, in verse 31, those who were in Hebron and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to rove. All these people who have assisted David, David saying, you may not have got a reward before, but here's a reward now. And for those who had been attacked, he's giving the other stuff back to them. He's giving them back their goods. And so amazingly, what David is doing, he's now once again, just knitting his heart to his brother. He's knitting his heart to Israel. He recognized, I'm a part of this. I'm not giving the spoils to Achish anymore. I'm taking all of it. I'm giving it to the children of Judah, and to the my brethren, and to the people of Israel. And so Amazingly, we do see that when David comes to this portion in verse 20, he took all the flocks, the herds that were driven before, the other livestock, and he said, "This is David's spoil." Now, when David came to the 200 men who had been so weary that they could not follow David, whom they also had made to stay at the brook of Bezor, so they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them. So David is just happy to see the 200 guys. They're recovered. They're strengthened now, and they come and they meet David, and David goes to greet them. And then in verse 22, it's interesting because we know the men who came to David were in debt and distress and discontented, and not all of them become mighty men because it says in verse 22, then all the wicked and worthless men, all the men who had the wrong heart, is what they're saying. The worthless men would be men of Belial, men of the enemy. So all the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David answered and said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil which we had recovered, except for every man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart. So he says these guys were just so bitter that these other ones were not doing what they did. These other ones were so to the point where they were exhausted. So you didn't come to the battle. But keep in mind that what they kept the stuff, they watched over the stuff. They lightened the load of those people who did go into battle. And I think it's so interesting. Do you share? Does the Lord share? In other words, does the Lord share rewards with those who are behind the scenes, to those who are not in front of the battle? And I do believe absolutely this is a principle that David speaks that is so of the Lord, is the keepers of the stuff. I know that as you know, I've been in the ministry so often. My wife has been behind, and she's been the keeper of the home, the keeper of the children, the keeper of so many things, keeper of me in a sense too. And God is going to reward her equally with what the rewards that I would have if there's any. And so I just think it's so incredible that here David makes a statement to these men when they said, listen, all they can do is take their families and they can go. And David says, no, my brethren, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us. Understand, when these guys, these worthless men, there in verse 22 said, because they did not go with us, because we're the ones who did this. David corrects them in verse 23. He says, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us, who has delivered into our hand the troop that came against us. David says, guys, this was not your battle. This was God's battle. And so you didn't win it. God won it. And part of the reason you won it, you didn't have to carry this extra load. You could lighten your load and just take what was necessary for battle. This last part that we had to travel, that was an amazing thing. And so when you have these weights and you take off the weight, you basically are just, feeling like you're so light now. You just go, on and on. And this is what was happening. And David reminds them that listen, this battle is not a physical. It was a physical battle, but keep in mind it was also a spiritual battle. God was the one. If you remember in Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 15, when the children of Israel were attacked, and as they were attacked, and what was happening was this: is that God would simply say, "Listen, these are the guys that when Joshua has to battle." He recognizes all of a sudden that here, as the Amalekites would attack them once again in Exodus chapter 17, that when Moses raised his hands with the rod in his hand, Joshua would have a victory. When his hands were weary and came down, Joshua would be losing. And so Aaron and Hur, of course, they put that stone underneath Moses and they held up his hands. And so they're holding up his hands. So Moses has this incredible victory. We understand so importantly that here the battle is spiritual, and that's what here David is recognizing, that it's a spiritual battle. God is the one who gave us this victory, and as God gave us the victory, it was him who's given us all of this stuff. It's not ours, it's God's. He gave it to us. We're stewards of it. And so it's not for yours to claim, it's not for yours to keep, it's to you to do what? To glorify God with it. And that's what David is telling these people that, hey, you were the people who stayed behind are equal with us who went forward. Those who are behind the scenes are just as important to God as those who are in the front of the scenes. And that's the beautiful thing about the way the Lord moves. And so he simply says, God has given to us, God has preserved us, and God was the one who allowed us the victory. God was the one who delivered the troop into um, our hands. And so in verse 24, he says, who will heed you in this matter? But as his part who goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stays by the supplies. They shall share alike. David's saying, we're not listening to you. You're not going to have your way on this. You're not going to let them go. David says that everyone shares and shares alike. Everyone gets the rewards of what's going on. And so it's just incredible that verse 25 says, and so it was from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. Now, when David had come to Ziklag, then all of a sudden we see that he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah. Not only does David share with those who are the keepers of the stuff, but now he shares with those who helped them out in the past. He shares with those who were still in Israel. He shares with those who were his family. David is just a giver. So incredible to see this part of heart of David. And this is what David begins to do. So amazingly, as we look to this passage, I do want you to see here that where David corrects these men, he doesn't allow what they want to do it. David leads these men to what is right, and as he leads these men to what is right, and then he now simply says, "This is the a statute." And verse 25 is so powerful because it was from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day, that those who go into the battle share equally with those who stay behind and to those who are the ones behind the scenes. And such a glorious truth that I do believe that God does. And then, of course, we've already read verses 26 through 31, where, and we've commented on multiple times where David comes to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah and to his friends, saying, here's a present for you from the enemies of the Lord. And of course, those who were in Bethel and all the other places of Ramah to the south, and of course, verse 31, to Hebron and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to row. David rewards as many people as he can. And you see this, that David at the beginning of this chapter was a loss and all alone. And now he has his family back. Now he has the families of the men back. Now he has an inroad to Judah back. He has family back. He has friends back in Israel. I want you to understand that the loss was not the end of the story. The loss was the beginning. And then so amazingly that God says, here's the end of this passage is gain, 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 gain. And may that be what we recognize whenever we go through a period of loss, that just know this, dear saint, it's the beginning of the story. It's not the end. It's the beginning of the event. It's not the end. Father, we're so grateful for who you are and how you work and just the beauty of just how you minister so wonderfully, Lord, to us, and how when there's a time of loss, if there's ever a time of loss, that we don't have to fear that loss. That loss is the beginning of the event, and then you want to give more back. You want to give even more back than what was beginning. You did it with Job. You did it here with David. And I believe it's a principle, Lord, that through your word you continue to speak of that. So may we just take hope in that. May we understand that if we're on the front lines or if we're behind the scenes, that God, we receive equally the rewards that go out. When there are people who are praying, Lord, for those who go out evangelizing, Lord, the people who are praying receive just as much reward and pleasure from you as those who go out door to door and go knocking, Lord. We understand this to be a truth, and we're so grateful, Lord, that you just equip us to who we are with our personalities. And not everyone is meant to go out. Some are meant to stay back. And so, but with that, regardless where the front lines or behind the scenes, Lord, you are the giver. You are always the giver, and the rewards are yours. and they're to be shared and shared just to as many people as we can, Lord. That's our heart to just see your children glorified and equally be partakers of the blessings. Oh, we ask this in